Breaking news. The New York Times is reporting that Trump's former finance chief, Allen Weisselberg, is in negotiations to plead guilty to perjury for allegedly lying on the stand during Trump's civil fraud trial. And while we don't know for certain which alleged lie Mr. Weisselberg might be owning up to, the testimony the New York Times points to, the thing they heavily suggest may be the lie in this case, is maybe the most Trumpy thing ever. Just a few months ago, back in October, Allen Weisselberg took the stand to defend the Trump Organization in New York Attorney General Letitia James' $250 million civil fraud lawsuit. That's the case where Trump and his company are being accused of defrauding investors by, among other things, inflating the value of their assets to obtain favorable loans from banks. And so one of the things Mr. Weisselberg was asked about, under oath, was the size of Donald Trump's penthouse apartment in Trump Tower, the one that looks like Louis XIV on acid. Now, the AG believes that this asset in particular is a glaring example of Donald Trump's fraudulent overvaluation. Yes, there are monster chandeliers and there are marble walls, but for years, this three-story penthouse was listed on annual financial statements as measuring more than 30,000 square feet, when in reality, it is just over 10,000 square feet. It is a third of that size, which in New York City real estate is just a colossal overstatement. And when Mr. Allen Weisselberg was asked, again under oath, if he had anything to do with that bonkers overstatement, he said, "I never focused on the triplex, to be honest with you. It was almost de minimis relative to Trump's net worth, so I really didn't focus on it." Which really appears to be a lie, under oath. It turns out that Mr. Trump and Mr. Weisselberg hadn't just been inflating the size and value of his apartment to the banks. Whether it was for his ego or for his brand or both, Trump has spent decades obsessed with making the Forbes 400 list. That's the list of the 400 wealthiest Americans, which, for the record, Donald Trump did not make this year. And Trump's relentless quest to be known as one of the wealthiest Americans meant that for decades now, Trump and his allies, including Allen Weisselberg, have relentlessly lobbied Forbes magazine, inviting reporters to that penthouse apartment, bragging to them on the phone and on email about how large and valuable it was, petitioning for it to be included in Trump's net worth. And the Forbes reporters kept those receipts. They knew that none of this was de minimis. And after Allen Weisselberg testified in the trial, Forbes announced a review of old emails and notes, some of which the Attorney General's office does not possess, show that Mr. Weisselberg absolutely thought about Donald Trump's apartment and played a key role in trying to convince Forbes reporters over the course of several years that it was worth more than it really was. In 2012, Weisselberg asked a Forbes reporter why the magazine counts large private estates for other billionaires and not Trump. Weisselberg said Forbes should be including Trump's New York penthouse. He thinks it's worth more than $88 million. The next year, 2013, Weisselberg kept pushing. A Forbes reporter wrote to a colleague, "Now Allen says it's worth $200 million. Allen. In 2014, Weisselberg sent Forbes sales records for a luxury apartment building near Trump's and then applied a per square foot rate calculation to demonstrate the value of Trump's apartment, which he said was 30,000 square feet. In 2015, Donald Trump toured 3 Forbes journalists around his penthouse with Allen Weisselberg at his side. During that tour, Donald Trump again claimed the apartment was 33,000 square feet. Now, after Forbes ran that story, proving that Allen Weisselberg did, in fact, focus on Donald Trump's apartment a lot, Allen Weisselberg abruptly stopped testifying to the New York Attorney General. Now, again, we do not know for certain that this is the alleged lie that Weisselberg is reportedly in negotiations to plead guilty to perjury for, but man, it certainly seems likely. And the New York Times gives us one other major clue as to what is behind these reported plea negotiations. The Times reports that the thing that set these negotiations in motion were renewed threats that Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg might file new charges against Mr. Weisselberg And those charges could mean the 76-year-old Weisselberg could be placed once again behind bars. Now, last year, Mr. Weisselberg spent 100 days in Rikers Island jail for his role in helping engineer a wide-ranging tax fraud scheme at Trump's family business. During that case back in 2022, not only did Weisselberg plead guilty, but part of his plea deal required him to testify at a civil trial that same year against the Trump Organization. So what does Allen Weisselberg's potential guilty plea here mean for Donald Trump? As the New York Times puts it tonight, although the potential agreement is unlikely to immediately affect Mr. Trump, it could strengthen Mr. Bragg's hand before the former president's trial. It could deter other witnesses in Mr. Trump's circle from lying on the stand. And perjury charges could discredit Mr. Weisselberg, who has disputed details of Mr. Bragg's evidence. In other words, this could all be quite material to that criminal case against Donald Trump, which is scheduled to begin on March 25th. And tonight, just hours ago, we got even more breaking news that makes that all the more important. Tonight, Jack Smith's federal election interference case just dropped off the D.C. court's calendar. Now, that case had originally been scheduled for March 4th, but now, due to delays caused by Trump's presidential immunity appeal, it looks like that date is off the books, very much TBD. So that is huge news for Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg. Bragg had previously made clear that he would defer to the federal cases if there was a scheduling conflict, but with Jack Smith's case now potentially delayed till who knows when, that could very well clear DA Bragg to take Donald Trump to trial as early as March 25th. What happens if one of the key defense witnesses in the first and maybe the only criminal trial Donald Trump is likely to face ends up behind bars? Joining me now are Suzanne Craig, New York Times investigative reporter, focused like a hawk on the finances and taxes of Donald Trump, and Joyce Vance, former U.S. attorney in the Northern District of Alabama and professor at the University of Alabama School of Law. Sue and Joyce, it's great to see you both. Thank you for being here tonight. I mean, Sue, apart from just the most Trumpy potential perjury ever, of course it comes back to Donald Trump's penthouse size. First, like, I get, if you could, help me understand Allen Weisselberg, who is so involved in this, like, valuation of the Trump penthouse, is on the phone to reporters, he's emailing them, he's really trying to say this thing is really worth a lot of money, and then goes and stands under oath and said, that was never my thing. I was not really that concerned about the valuation of that. It was de minimis to his financial portfolio.
That's a hard one. It's as if he didn't, I don't know, maybe he had amnesia when he got up there that day. I just want to say, to start off with, shout out to Forbes and to Dan Alexander, the reporter involved in that reporting, and who's able to almost immediately bring it to light, and also to the Times tonight for my colleagues for this great story. It was sort of masterfully done with a lot of different pieces about Allen Weisselberg, who we have not talked about, you and I, for, it seems like, years. I think it's probably been several months. But I think where we left off, they were, looking at charging him for misrepresenting or lying to an insurance company about an asset, saying that it had a valuation on it that it didn't. And then that sort of went on the back burner. And now all of a sudden this has popped up. Right ahead of this trial. And it definitely does look like they're trying to send a message to other witnesses about the perils of lying on the stand. But it's incredible just to see what Forbes was able to almost immediately surface on Allen Weisselberg's seemingly, years-long campaign to have the value of that penthouse put much higher than it should have been.
Yeah, well, I mean, and Sue name checks Dan Alexander, who was the reporter who dealt with Mr. Weisselberg, and then I believe, control room can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe is in the room when Weisselberg is just plainly lying on the stand. To me, that suggests, and this is after Allen Weisselberg has already served time at Rikers, a level of a sense of impunity on the part of at least the Trump defendants, if not Trump himself, when it comes to matters of the court. It's just shocking to me that it would be so brazen. It shouldn't be, I guess. Should it?
I mean, it is incredibly brazen, particularly when you think about prosecutors' sensitivity to perjury. Perjury is one of those charges that if you can prove it, you bring it, because it's so central to the importance of truth-telling in the criminal justice system. But it's worth noting a couple of things, Alex. First off, perjury charges are hard to make, and we can't really assess whether there's a strong case here without seeing the actual questions he was asked and his answers. There has to be a clear match with no waffle room in order for it to be perjury. So, you know, I think that's important. And then this is reporting that plea negotiations are underway. We know how fragile that can be. Anyone who lived through the Hunter Biden debacle understands that until the judge accepts a plea of guilt in the courtroom, there is no deal.